Hey everybody, welcome to more week 4 in this series, Who is the Church? We've been journeying through all these different illustrations, if you will, given throughout Scripture, describing who the church is. And we ended this series this past Sunday in that passage in Ephesians chapter 2, discovering that the church is God's family, God's household. You know, the image of the church being the dwelling place of God, not a building, but individuals, is an image that has really permeated Scripture from the beginning. All the way back in Genesis chapter 28, we read of Jacob wrestling with God, and then all these different times he had these visions and encounters with God. And there was one that we know of as Jacob's ladder, where he sees angels ascending and descending on a ladder, and he wakes up and he determines that this is the house of God, the dwelling place of God, and he renames the place Bethel, the house of God. It's an incredible illustration then that really just drives forward throughout Scripture over and over again, talking about the temple of God, where Moses would be instructed to build the tabernacle, and then Solomon would build the temple, and we would find in that innermost part of the tabernacle and the temple, the Holy of Holies, where God would come down and dwell with men, all the way to the New Testament, where we find in the Gospel of John, the Bible saying the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then on the cross, Jesus ripping the temple veil, exposing the Holy of Holies and exposing God to humanity, this idea that we are the house of God. Paul would, as he did in Ephesians throughout many of his letters, write about that image of being the house of God or the dwelling place of God. I want to take you to another passage today because I think we see, and hopefully you saw Sunday from the message, that this image of the church being the family or the house of God is such a powerful image. I want to take you to the book of 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is writing to the church and talking about the leadership in the church and the role that God's servants play in the church. And he uses two images. He uses agriculture and he uses architecture. Agriculture and architecture were favorites of his. And the third chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians, he talks about the role of planting and watering and growing a crop. And he speaks of the role that God's servant, God's pastor would play in that. And then in verse number 9 of chapter 3, he says, "For we are God's workmen, co-workers, you are God's field, God's building." And we have this incredible image of what it looks like to be God's building. I want to read the next two verses, 1 Corinthians 3, verses 10 and 11, and just unpack that for a minute or two here to kind of close out our series, and then allow the questions to either guide you through some private, personal time or discussion in group time. This again is 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. "According to God's grace that was given to me, I have laid a foundation as a skilled master builder, and another builds on it. But each one is to be careful how he builds on it. For no one can lay any other foundation than what has been laid down. That foundation is Jesus Christ." Of course, he's talking about the ministry of pastoring and leading and growing a church, but the image of the building and a foundation being laid so that something can be built on it is such a powerful image. The church is God's building, God's family. And as we look at this, it's a clear picture for us. The foundation of any building that is going to be the dwelling place of God must mean that the foundation is, in fact, Jesus Christ. Paul, when he came to Corinth, he made this statement early in the letter back in chapter 2. He says, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, announcing the mystery of God to you, I did not come with brilliance of speech or wisdom. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." And so if we're going to have this dwelling place of God, if we are going to be that temple of God, that place where God resides, we have to build on the foundation that is Jesus Christ. As we think about all the things we might do in the church, as we think about who we, the church, are, representing Jesus to the world, it will never work unless the foundation that we've laid, the foundation that we build on, is in fact Jesus alone. All the way through Scripture, God has been making this promise that He was going to come and dwell among us, and then ultimately dwell in us, that we would become the temple of God. Now that we are God's building, God's family, as we heard this past Sunday, we have this incredible promise that if we lay the right foundation, if we build on the right foundation, that God will always remain in us and with us, and that we can be that perfect picture to the world around us of what the love of God looks like. We have to build carefully. We have to use the right materials after we lay the right foundation. So take some time in the Scriptures, take some time in the questions to follow as we close out this series. Next week, we begin a brand new series looking at the journey of life from beginning to end and what those seasons of the life that we live really entail. What is God doing in each? What are we learning in each? How is God using us in the seasons that we go through in life? It should be a great series throughout the month of October, and we can't wait to have you join us back here for more each and every week in between those Sundays. God bless you. We'll see you then.